Hello, and I'm back with another horror novel review. The last couple of days I've been reading this delightful thing here from Shaun Hutson called Slugs, published in 1982. And, well, let me do the preliminaries first. So the cover art is by a guy called Mark Taylor, who did a lot of cover art for Time Warner's horror paperbacks. And it is suitably disgusting. It's a short novel at 208 pages, and here's the back, which very simply says, they slime, they ooze, they kill. One female slug can lay 1.5 million eggs a year, a fact which holds terrifying consequences for the people of Merton. As the town basks in the summer heat, a new breed of slug is growing and multiplying. In the waist-high grass, in the dank, dark cellars, they are acquiring new tastes, new cravings, for blood, for flesh, human flesh. Yep, so Slugs from 1982. Shaun Hutson is a very prolific writer, and it's not easy to pin down what his debut novel was, in part because he has an enormous number of pseudonyms. In fact, he has more pseudonyms than most published novelists have novels. But what I can say with some confidence is that Slugs was his first novel to garner some attention in the horror community back in the day. And it was published when he was just 24 years old. For a little bit of perspective on that, that's 3 years younger than Stephen King was when he published his first novel, Carrie. And Slugs isn't the same level as Carrie, but it's still a very impressive piece of early 80s horror fiction from somebody so young. And just a little bit about Hutson, because his name is fairly well known, but he's not anywhere near the level of the really big horror writers. I don't know how it is in America. He's quite big in the UK, but anyone in the US and other countries of the world watching this, I don't know, let me know if you're familiar with this guy, because I really don't know. But a little bit about him. What you get with Shaun Hutson is a good time. He's in some ways like the English answer to Richard Lehman. Although Hutson is very serious about his craft, he's not at all pretentious. He's not trying to write for the ages. His writing never strays into the kind of purple overwriting trap that, say, James Herbert sometimes did. He just tells good stories well, and he usually scatters a bunch of his passions throughout them, which I really, really like. In the acknowledgements pages of his novels, he's often thanking people like Metallica, Iron Maiden, Queensryche, Liverpool Football Club, where some novelists will begin books with quotes by philosophers and other literary figures. Shaun Hutson will kick things off with a Ronnie James Dio lyric, which is absolutely fine by me. He seems like a very genuine guy, and there's a genuineness and an authenticity to his writing, which I like very, very much. Just a total lack of pretension. With that said, though, about not aiming for great literature, that's not to say that his novels don't sometimes have some interesting commentary going on. And here, for example, in Slugs, I don't know how much he was influenced by The Rats by James Herbert, but this novel shares some of that novel's kind of subtextual concerns with poverty and slums and the divide between rich and poor, which in the 80s would only get worse and worse as the decade wore on. In Rats, James Herbert was partially criticizing the post-war slums of London. Here, in Hutson's novel, we have the slugs migrating over from their proper place on the poor side of town with all the unwashed proles who nobody cares about, over to what Hutson just calls the new estate, where it's implied all like the middle class folk are moving in to go about their comfortable lives. There are some critical comments in this book made towards the Conservative Party, England's Conservative Party. This book was written 3 years, I think, into Margaret Thatcher's reign of terror in England, and the main hero of this book, Mike Brady, is a cynical lefty, which is always nice to see. You've got a lot of that in English novels of the 80s. Ramsey Campbell, James Herbert Hutson. You would get a lot of kind of social commentary going on about the way that England was going throughout the Thatcher years. But like I said, that's not that's subtextual, and it's not obtrusive. He's not beating you over the head with that stuff. It's mainly this is about story. So what is the story? What is the plot here? Well, a new breed of massive slugs are killing people in the town of Merton in various awful ways. That's it. And the local health inspector, Mike Brady, along with a couple of sidekicks, they fight them. They fight back. Yeah, plot-wise, it's obvious what it is. and I'm not going to spend too much more time on it. Instead, I'm going to talk about how this story is written. As usual, I'll divide it into the negatives and the positives, but the negatives, I would just really be nitpicking here if I went into negatives, and I don't really want to do that with a novel that is so competently written by someone who was a mere 24 years old. I guess you could say that the narrative plays out a little bit like a bunch of connected short stories where we're kind of introduced to a new character at the beginning of a chapter, and then over the course of about 10 pages, the slugs kill them. You could argue that there's some understandable naivety and inexperience in the writing here, in that the episodes follow the same formula of introducing us to a new character. We learn their job, we learn a little bit of backstory, one or two character traits, and then the slugs get them and kill them. That formula, name, job, short anecdote to illustrate character, then gruesomely killed off, that would probably have been handled differently by a more experienced and confident Shaun Hutson. Well, in fact, I can say that with some confidence because I've read his later work, and he really did become a very skilled novelist in great command of pace and narrative. So this does show some of the common traps of a debut novel, or at least a fledgling writer, in terms of how the story is told. He could have perhaps created a deeper sense of the town and have us get to know the characters a bit more naturally. But again, this really is nitpicking the style a bit, because what he did deliver, despite the episodic nature of the way the slugs kill people, I did have huge fun with. So that's it for the negatives. Let me now wax euphoric about the positives. First and foremost, this is surprisingly well written for somebody so young, and the grand finale I found to be legitimately tense. This is a very unpleasant novel, but I mean that in a good way. I mean, the opening chapter, once you get past the prologue, is almost vomit-inducing in the way that it's described. In some ways, this book, this theme, could have been a very lazy thing for a horror novelist to do, because you really don't have to work all that hard as a writer to make slugs disgusting. I imagine most people in the world are revolted by them. But what you do have to work hard at is making the reader forget just how ludicrous the setup is of this story. Man-eating slugs. If you're going to be pursued by a creature that wants to eat you, short of a crippled asthmatic turtle, you'd probably choose the slug. I mean, these things aren't known for chasing humans down. But believe it or not, Hutson does actually do a very good job of somehow making it just about plausible. The death scenes ring true in a very odd way. And I do know how ridiculous that sounds, but he really does. You just have to read it for yourself. There's a section where the health inspector is asking a scientist at the museum if it's possible for slugs to be doing this. And firstly, the scientist is like, no, are you out of your mind? Of course not. But then after thinking it over and weighing it up, he comes to the conclusion, yeah, I guess it kind of is. And even though in the real world it actually isn't, the way that Hutson writes this story makes you believe that it could happen. It's very effectively done. What else do I like about this story? It's a small thing, but I love all the contemporary references that it gets in here. There's one to there's an oft-repeated one to the band Iron Maiden. One of the addresses that they go to is 22 Acacia Avenue, which any Iron Maiden fan will know what that refers to. Later on, there's this young guy and his girlfriend listening to a song, and the title isn't mentioned, but it's obviously Number of the Beast. And Hutson really did have his finger on the pulse there, by the way, because Number of the Beast, the album by Iron Maiden, was released in March 1982. This book was published just a few months after that. And, at the time, Maiden weren't the monolithic metal acts they are today. Number of the Beast was their first major album after the debut in Killers. So anyway, as a metal fan, an Iron Maiden fan, it was just fun to see all those references in there. Back when Iron Maiden was still starting out to an extent. Other little things like little details of the time, like having to get up off your armchair to switch channels on the TV. I remember that. I'm old enough to remember that. I like the style of this book in that it's a mixture of standard, well-written English prose, but it also has this British slang throughout it, which just made me feel comfortable. It made me feel like Hutson was just telling me personally a story, because all the slang he's using was common to me in the 1980s growing up. So is this a classic horror novel? No, it isn't, but it is a great fun early 80s pulpy literary nasty, to play on video nasty. It is definitely that. And I was a little bit surprised. I had read this before, but it was a long time ago, as in 20 years ago. Rereading it now, I was surprised at how well it's held up. In the 1980s, there were a lot of novels like this, which took creepy crawlies and various bugs or rodents or insects and made novels out of them. This is one of the better ones, along with Rats by Herbert, which I will be reviewing fairly soon. This is one of the better ones of that subgenre. And in 1988, just to close this review, this novel received an incredibly entertaining film adaptation, which was released by Arrow a few years back. Entertaining, I said, not necessarily good, because this is kind of all over the place. It's hilarious in some of its ineptitude, but do check it out. Not before you've read the book. Read the novel first, so you can compare it. But anyway, yeah, the film adaptation is good, so give that a watch at some point. So let me wrap this up then. Slugs, 1982, Shaun Hutson. A very, very good novel by a very gifted young man who will go on to become an incredibly gifted man. So that's it. I'll be back soon with another horror novel review. Until then, thanks very much for watching it. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.